Coming up next on Arizona Horizon, it's the Journalist Roundtable. We'll look at the week's top stories, including the replacement of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. The Journalist Roundtable is next on Arizona Horizon.
Arizona Horizon is made possible by contributions from the Friends of Arizona PBS, members of your public television station.
Good evening and welcome to Arizona Horizon. I'm Mark Brody, in for Ted Simons. It's Friday, and that means it's time for the Journalist Roundtable. Joining us tonight, Jim Small from the Arizona Mirror, Jessica Boehm from Axios Phoenix, and Wayne Schutsky from KJZZ Radio. Thanks to you all for being here. Yep. So, Wayne, let me start with you. President Trump fired this week Kristi Noem, the now former head, or soon-to-be former head of the Department of Homeland Security. There's been so much talk of ICE maybe coming here, maybe not coming here, maybe coming here around election time. Does it make a difference? Is there a sense that there's going to be a difference with Markwayne Mullin, assuming the senator from Oklahoma gets confirmed, with him in charge as opposed to Kristi Noem?
Short answer is no. He seems to be kind of a similar type of person, a very close Trump ally. I think Trump probably appointed him because he likes the way that he goes out and defends Trump's policies, on camera. And so I think this is a matter, I heard someone refer to it as changing the person but not the policy, and I think that's what we're seeing here. We're just seeing another Trump fighter inserted into the role because the last one became too problematic.
Maybe, Jessica, a matter of messaging things differently as opposed to the actual policy, what they're actually doing?
Perhaps. I mean, I don't, like Wayne said, I don't see an ideological shift here at all, but Kristi Noem as a person just kind of demands attention, and that obviously got to a point where the attention was no longer positive in many ways, and I think that we'll probably see less flashy, maybe less made for social media things, but at the end of the day, I think the new nominee is very much a hardline Trump supporter, and whatever the president wants the message to be is what the message is going to be.
Jim, does it seem as though there might be any differences if they, for example, decide to surge ICE into another community, Phoenix or anywhere else, that in theory maybe it would be a little less chaotic, maybe fewer people would die?
I think really we're not in a position to answer that. I don't think right now. And I do think it's worth noting that President Trump told governors last week at an event at the White House that he would not send ICE into states and into cities where they were not wanted, which is interesting. We'll see if that happens, if that is a promise that gets kept. But certainly Democrats coming out of that meeting with the president, were talking about that and said, look, we're going to hold him to this, and we want to make sure that this is the case. So it does seem as though there has been some shift. I think Minneapolis and Minnesota was really damaging for President Trump's mass deportation efforts, for his agenda, for the public perception of him. I think that, that really rattled a lot of Americans who otherwise, I think, were fine with the idea of mass deportation, but not, I think when they saw what it looked like in practice, including and up to the fact that they shot and killed 2 American citizens who were protesting, I think that soured kind of soured the punch for the Trump administration, and I don't know exactly what it's going to look like going forward. I can't imagine they're going to walk away from the idea of deporting 10 million people.
Well, and Wayne, it's probably worth noting that cities in Arizona, Phoenix, and Tucson among them have been preparing and planning for what to do if and when ICE shows up here.
Yeah, they have. They've been kind of trying to figure out exactly what their response is going to be, what's the local police department response going to be, what's their responsibilities in these situations. And it's worth noting that ramp up is already kind of happening. On our station, we've had reporting that, HSI, which is a division of ICE and investigative, has been doing operations. The Zips one is that a lot of people have heard of as a good example, but there's been a few others. So it is already happening, just thus far not on the level of, Minnesota.
Yeah, and I think that's right. We haven't seen the dedicated surge where they send in 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 armed agents into Arizona, but we have absolutely seen an increase. Arizona Luminaria had a really great reporting this week about I want to say it was 4 or 5 times the number of just arrests, just basically street arrests that have happened in the past year over the year before, and that's due to the fact that the Trump administration it has even quietly just increased the amount of ICE that is out there patrolling and out there, looking for people to deport.
Jessica, I'm going to make maybe an awkward transition here. I want to ask you about an Auditor General's report that is new that found that spending in Arizona school districts was down about half a cent from between last year and the year before, 52.1 cents down from 52.6 cents. Lawmakers, of course, are pushing a proposal to try to get that up to 60 cents for every dollar, which is kind of what they've been doing for what seems like a very, very long time. What's the significance of this actual hard data now?
Absolutely. So I think that this is just something that Republicans can point to in their continued mission to get up to that 60 cents.
Yeah.
I was like, dollars? No. And I think what is important to note is that there are, as we all know, inflation has taken a toll on all of our budgets, and that's definitely been the case for schools. And so school administrators would tell you that this money that's not being spent on direct instruction is not going to, throw parties. It's going to pay for buses and the cost of gas that it costs to transport students. One thing I found really interesting in the report is that while enrollment is declining, the number of students needing special education services is increasing. And those services, whether they're counselors, speech-language pathologists, those are not counted as direct instruction. So I think there's a lot of nuance in the report, but the top line is what Republican lawmakers are throwing out there and saying, look, things are going in the wrong direction, and we need to find a way, perhaps at the ballot box, to get them back to that 60 cent.
Yeah, and Jim, this is a talking point that people at the legislature have been talking about for a very, very long time.
Absolutely. I think I've seen 20 years worth of this talk about 60 cents out of every dollar being in the classroom, being like this magical number that things are going to somehow be different, and that's what the problem is with Arizona schools' performance and with all of this. At the end of the day, there's still, I think you have a funding discussion, right? Arizona still ranks perpetually 47th, 48th, 49th in the nation in terms of per pupil funding. Things are even more challenging now with the Universal School Voucher ESA program that is siphoning when we talk about declining enrollment and the students who are being left behind being those that need the most attention and the most specialized services. That's a driving factor in that, is that you have these ESA vouchers are allowing families in a lot of cases to go, and the ones that are left behind, I think, are the ones that are struggling the most and are in the situations where they're not able to take advantage of a voucher or a private school or anything like that.
Wayne, how much debate, how much discrepancy could there be in how you classify what is a classroom expense?
I think Jessica kind of made a good point that there are things that, the layman's person might think is a classroom expense, these special instructions that aren't. There's other things that don't fall into that category, but are like static costs that a school is going to experience, whether or not they have 1,000 students or 500 students. That's things like air conditioning. Mm-hmm. Like you're air conditioning the whole building, whether or not it's full or half full or whatever, and those costs don't go away just because enrollment declines. And so as you're losing students, you might see less money going into the classroom for that instruction, but those other costs are staying the same, and that's where you start seeing those levels change. So that's, again, it's nuance. There's a broader discussion to be had about how do we keep schools funded, because, again, public schools have to provide instruction to anyone who needs it, so whether there's 5 kids left in a school district, they still have to provide that instruction, whereas private schools charged don't exactly have to do that.
Jessica, you mentioned administrative costs. The report did find that administrative costs are up, but it didn't seem like by a ton.
Right. Yeah. That was what was interesting, was like it really felt like the majority of the costs that were increasing were these things that, like, air conditioning costs more, like the cost of electricity is higher now. Things that all of our budgets are a little bit tighter, and we're probably spending more money on things than we used to as well. Yes, administrative costs are up, but again, I think when we think of administrators, we're thinking of like just a principal in an office, and I think what we've learned, or hopefully are learning, about how schools are governed and administered is that there's a lot of nuance in like what services. Like I think that some of these providers we're talking about, the speech language pathologists, like that is included, school nurses, in an administrative category, whereas maybe that's not what the normal everyday person is thinking of when they think of administrator.
Right. So
I think there's a broader discussion too, though, about administrative salaries. I mean, superintendents, for instance, do make a lot of money, and there are certain districts that have had a lot of problems that have some of the highest paid superintendents in the state. So I think there's a legitimate discussion to be had about who should be running these districts and how much they should be paid. The opposite side of that, as someone who's covered school districts in the not so far past, is that it's really hard to hire a superintendent. You know, it's a job where you're going to get a lot of criticism nowadays, especially on social media. We've had high-level superintendents in big districts quit because of that, and so you're pulling from a smaller and smaller pool of people. So sometimes those incentives, the pay, and all the perks are how you get a qualified candidate to take the job.
So, Jim, this 60 cents for every dollar in the classroom could be on the ballot. Another race that will be on the ballot, the governor's race. Of course, Governor Hobbs, her term will be up. She's running for re-election. There's a new poll this week that found that in the GOP primary, this is the first poll that we've really seen, public poll, since Karen Taylor Robson left that race. It found that Andy Biggs is leading David Schweikert 40 to 19%, with 41% undecided. I'm curious what you make of those sort of top line numbers.
Not terribly surprising, I don't think. Andy Biggs has been in the race longer. I think it has cuts a larger profile than David Schweikert. Both are coming out of Congress, so they've got probably, I'm sure, much higher ID, individually within their districts. But David Schweikert has not. I think his campaign is really. I think we've just started to see it really get going in a different way. I think so. There's been some more TV ads and things like that, and that's only going to increase as this race, heads into this July primary. But it certainly, I think, speaks to the fact that Andy Biggs is, kind of has that MAGA base behind him, and that Turning Point USA, that apparatus is supporting him. And so I think that it's going to be a difficult road, for David Schweikert to overcome that.
And Wayne, the obvious caveats here, poll is a moment in time, a snapshot of a point in time. We're a long way away from the July primary and obviously very far from the November election. But is it possible at this point yet to tell where the Robeson voters might be going yet? Or is that maybe reflected in that large number of undecideds?
What Robeson voters? I'm just joking. I think it's much too early. I mean, when you have 41% undecided, I think it's just... That's a huge chunk, and to see which direction they're going to go on this, you'd have to look at the priorities of those voters, and we just don't know a lot about that. And so I think if we see Karen Taylor Robson come out and back one candidate, then that might shift the wind a little bit, asking her supporters to go behind one or the other. But I don't know if that's going to happen based on her statement calling for unity in the party. I think she just wants to let the primary kind of play out as it is.
Jessica, in the general election, Governor Hobbs was ahead of both Congressman Biggs and Schweikert, 42 to 37 over Biggs, 44 to 35 over Schweikert, with 16% undecided in both matchups. Mm-hmm. Is that, like, if you're the Hobbs campaign, how are you feeling about that?
I wouldn't take too much stock in it at this point. Like, I think right now, again, poll is moment in time, and I think what this probably shows more than anything, as like a lot of voters are just not paying attention to the gubernatorial race, and this is probably a reflection of how they feel about the Trump administration, which we know from other public polling is not trending in their favor. And so I think this is probably more of an example of people having an opinion about Republicans and Democrats and making their decision that way. That being said, you would kind of expect that Hobbs would be doing a little bit better given the polling we're seeing of how people are reacting to, for example, the mass deportation efforts. So I don't think this says a whole lot either way. I guess obviously Hobbs would rather be ahead than behind, but with 16% undecided even in a general election, that still gives a lot of leeway there.
Jim, I mean, obviously there's the conventional wisdom is that the party in power, the president's party, tends to do less well in the midterms. Is there any expectation that might filter down to non-federal races? Like, could the governor's race be affected by the popularity of the president?
I think just about every race that has an R and a D in it is going to be affected by it, honestly. Yeah, I think that sets the tone for this election, right? And that's when voters are showing up to the polls. If voters are angry at the administration in power, in this case, the Republicans and the Trump administration, when they show up at the polls, they're going to take it out on whatever candidates they can that are there. Donald Trump isn't on the ballot this time, but boy, Andy Biggs is, or David Schweikert is, or go up and down the ballot. And so I think you are absolutely going to see that. And certainly some of the early polling has shown that this might be building into a very strong year for Democrats. We'll have to see. There is a lot of runway between now and November, and a lot of things can change.
Yeah, a lot of time. Wayne, something else that voters might be deciding is whether or not to kick the legislature out of the Capitol by April 30th, whether they're done or not, right? I mean, the House passed a measure that would ask voters to do just that.
Yeah, and us Capitol reporters can only hope. Essentially, just a little history. The legislative session is kind of technically supposed to end on April 30th. It's a very soft deadline that they have in their own rule, but it's very easy for them to get around it, and they very often do. We usually are there till June 30th for them to get a budget done. So this is from Representative Justin Wilmoth, a Republican from Phoenix, who basically said, there's no reason for most of us to be there if all we have left to do is a budget. Because basically, that's negotiated by the Senate President, the House Speaker, and the Governor's office. They can continue to hash that out while the rest of us go home, and then call us in for a special session whenever they figure out the deal, versus keeping us around and we're all kicking tires waiting for this deal to get done.
Which is kind of what they've done the last couple of years, right? They've taken, they haven't adjourned, but they've taken breaks where negotiations have ostensibly happened behind the scenes, and the rank and file sort of come in when there's something to vote on.
That's right. Yeah, they've taken a lot of these really long breaks, but this has implications for pay and per diems and stipends and all of that. So this is really incentivizing everyone else to get their leadership in order and get these budgets done, because now they're not going to be getting paid to sit around.
And Jessica, this is also kind of going along with another proposed ballot referral that would basically say if the budget's not done by April 30th, no one's getting paid.
Right. And I think that, well, I have to say, I'm working with the Salt Lake City team this week, and they are adjourning today. Like, they have to.
Wow.
It'll be over. And I was just daydreaming at the thought of knowing when our legislative session would be over. But I think this begs a bigger question, right? Like, we've talked about lawmaker pay. Should we pay them more? Should this be a full-time legislature? We have all of these questions. And I think that the point that's being made here is, if we're going to have this part-time session, let's have a date. Let's know when we're doing it. And of course, the flip side of that is, what if you have a really important policy discussion and it's April 30th and they say, sorry, go away. You could call a special session, so I don't know if it's as dramatic as it's being made out to be, but we have these conversations, it feels like, every year as people get like feisty and want to start maybe their election campaigns or other things.
So, Jim, Republican legislative leadership has talked about how they're going to need to sort of whittle down. There's a lot of proposed ballot referrals out there. Is there a sense that these two or one of them might be among those that make the cut? I
think it's early. It's a little early to say. That's usually a decision that kind of gets made, much closer to the end of session, whenever that may be, since it won't be April 30th.
Won't be
right?
April 30th.
Yeah. Essentially what'll happen is everything will get to within one or two steps of being, put on the ballot. And then they'll sit down and they'll figure out, look at them and figure out, A, I think which ones they think are most important. And, B, what the campaign looks like for it. Is there someone lining up to pass it? Is there someone lining up to oppose it? What are we looking at here? And after that, I think it's a matter of like, well, how many do we want to put on the ballot? Do we want to put, do we want to send 5 up? Do we want to send 15 up? We've seen them do both. They've made both decisions in the past. Certainly, the longer the ballot gets, the harder it gets to pass anything, because voters at a certain point just say, all right, we're not doing this, and we're going to vote no. And, I think we saw that just a couple of years ago. We had a record-long ballot, and that was, I think 2/3 of them, maybe 75% of them failed. I'm sure in some part because of ballot fatigue.
Is it possible, Wayne, to sort of envision what the yes or no campaigns on these might be and how robust they might be?
On these specific ones, I haven't really heard anything. I've heard very lukewarm takes from lawmakers other than the sponsors, some who, are kind of okay, obviously it passed, okay with it, some who are a little uneasy about it, but it's hard to envision with so many other issues potentially on the ballot which group is going to be like, this is the place I have to park my money. So that's, as Jim said, when they're looking at who's going to oppose this, who's going to support it, that's where it could end up on the cutting room floor, I think.
And Jessica, I would think that with all the statewide offices up, not to mention Congress and all the legislators, they're, for the first time in what seems like a very long time, we don't have a Senate race. Obviously, the president is not on the ballot, but still a lot of sort of big money things potentially on the ballot.
There's a lot of places to spend money, and I have to say, like, as much as we might enjoy having an April 30th end date, I don't think is where the money's going to go.
So you're saying they're not going to do something just because the Capitol Press Corps wants it to happen?
It's been known to not be their biggest priority, yeah.
All right, Wayne, let me ask you very quickly about a bill that the Senate approved this week on transparency. This came sort of in the wake of a little bit of a scandal with the governor's office with what the Republicans are calling a pay-for-play operation. What exactly would this bill do?
This bill would essentially require folks with state contract or seeking state contracts or those who have them to disclose anything of value, in quotes. So political contributions, that type of thing, to a governor or associated political campaigns as a way to just kind of get it all out there, which would go to the root of this issue that you mentioned, where a contractor with the state received a big old pay bump after they had also given a whole lot of money to the Hobbs campaign and associated endeavors.
Jessica, obviously the governor usually does not comment on bills before they get to her, but we know that she vetoed something similar last year. Any reason to think she might have a change of heart?
Well, she is proposing her own transparency initiative that would basically like make it so that you can't be doing political donations during a bidding process. That's what she would prefer to see. I think that given the fact that she's going into an election year and the pay to play is going to have a real nice ring to it in TV ads, she might want to reconsider.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Guys, thanks all for being here. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.
And that'll do it for this edition of Arizona Horizon. I'm Mark Brody, in for Ted Simons. Thank you so much for being here. Have a great weekend.
Hello, I'm Alice Ferris, and we hope you enjoyed Arizona Horizon. For more than 40 years, viewers in Arizona have relied on Ted Simons and Arizona Horizon for in-depth coverage of issues of concern to